First, I'm going to ask you to welcome Representative Bina Nguyen, who has sponsored a bill related to solitary confinement. So please join us and tell us about your bill.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. My name is Bina Nguyen, and I represent House District 89, which is the City of Atlanta in unincorporated DeKalb County. And I'm the daughter of refugees from Vietnam who came over in the late 70s. And I think that my journey, as it pertains to really recognizing the system that we have here in Georgia with our criminal legal system and our immigration system has been part of my family narrative. So my dad was incarcerated as a prisoner of war for 3 years in Vietnam, and just growing up and watching him, and also as an adult, I recognized that incarceration changed who he could have been. I've reflected upon that a lot during my life and wondered, might we have a better relationship? Might he have more trust with the members of our family and with society in general? He doesn't really talk about what happened to him. We do know that he was isolated in a prison in the middle of the jungle, and we do know that he was subjected to starvation and to hard labor, but we don't know a whole lot of details of what other things may have transpired. And so, because it's been such a personal part of my life story, the immigration system has always been something that I have felt connected to in doing work with young people who are undocumented and watching their family members go through the process of deportation, and then recognizing that we have some facilities in Georgia here that are for-profit that incarcerate immigrants, and there are very full practices that these facilities use, including the use of solitary confinement, with no accountability for how they're using that. And as I began to watch what's happening in those facilities in South Georgia, where they're tucked far away from people, where family members have a hard time accessing because there's no place to stay, it's so far away. We also know the complications of not being able to drive if you're undocumented, and so we just have a lot of people who are held in isolation in a for-profit center, two for-profit centers in South Georgia. As I began to look at those practices, I started to recognize that I also had to understand my role as a state lawmaker and understand the connection to our criminal legal system and the same practices that are being utilized in our state prisons, in our state jails here in Georgia. And that is when I understood the opportunity that I had in terms of talking about the use of solitary confinement from a state perspective, and that we have the ability to change those laws. So in Georgia, we have almost no restrictions around how we use solitary confinement. And recently, the Southern Center for Human Rights sued and won a lawsuit that required a policy change at one state prison, Jackson State Prison, for the excessive use of solitary confinement. And that policy change says that for every 24 hours of being held in solitary, the individual must have 4 hours outside of that cell. I believe that if that is true for one state prison, it should be true for all of the facilities across Georgia, and it should be codified into state law. I think that is one step in the right direction. Last year, we were able to pass a bill that has a prohibition against placing pregnant women and postpartum women in solitary through the efforts of advocacy groups, many of the people who are here today, and various lawmakers who understood how incredibly harmful and inhumane it is to hold women in solitary confinement, especially pregnant women and women who have just given birth. And so the bill that I have, House Bill 714, and I want to thank the Southern Center for helping me craft out a thoughtful bill and really think about what that looks like for people who are held in solitary. So it's not just the restriction and the ability for somebody to get 4 hours outside of their cells, also access to things that make us human beings, which is access to other people in daylight and books and magazines and the things that continue to allow people to function in the ways that we should. And so the bill itself extends the protections for solitary confinement and the restriction of it for who we consider to be our vulnerable populations. So that is anyone over the age of 65, juveniles, people with mental health issues, people with developmental disabilities, and people who identify as LGBTQ. And that's just a starting point for what we would like to do in terms of solitary confinement in the state of Georgia. I believe that it should be eradicated altogether or very rarely used, but I also understand the political climate here in Georgia, and I think that's a good starting point. I think that it is a powerful thing for us to be able to talk about it because solitary confinement is exactly what it is. We're hiding people away, we're locking them away, they have no voice, and it's a hidden thing that we're not really talking about enough. I don't think that our lawmakers understand it enough, and I think it's our job here to make sure that they understand how incredibly inhumane it is and how it causes post-traumatic stress syndrome. And if they just experience a little bit of it themselves, I think that we can change some minds around that. So thank you for being here, and thank you for letting me share my work and my story with you. And thank you especially to Marissa Dodson from the Southern Center for working with me on this bill.
Thank you so much for telling us about your bill. One of the things that I want to highlight that she just said is that, we were able to get some great legislation passed last year through the work of many people, including people like us who are in this room who are advocating for these changes. So our voices matter. Our representatives want to know what we think of what's important to us. So make sure that you're shaping your beliefs and your values outside of this room, using those opinions and making sure that your representatives know what's important to you. I'd like to ask your representative Henry to come talk with us about something that I very much appreciate, which is that he has visited several of our prisons here in Georgia. So that's something that you're not
So I'm Greg Kennedy. I represent House District 102, which is up in Gwinnett County, a chunk of Lawrenceville, some of Swanee, a little bit of Jeffersonville. My path here to the Capitol is being by way of my work ending homelessness. I have a transitional program up in Gwinnett County. We serve about 80 folks at a time who are coming from various circumstances of homelessness. A typical client of ours has low academic achievement in their history. There's a mental health diagnosis, a subsequent addiction to substance, and a felony background. So in trying to lift people out of poverty and homelessness in particular, we just keep brushing up against these barriers. One is the criminal record, one is the lack of access to mental health. So it drove me to run for office to try to work on the policies and the legislation. My favorite Dr. King quote says, true compassion is more than just flinging a coin at a beggar, but it comes to understand that an edifice that creates beggars needs to be restructured. So in our program, I'm working with individuals on the behavioral side of the issue, but now as a representative, I want to work on the system and the structure that's creating these kind of conditions. So as soon as I hit the floor running as a representative, I started building relationships with the Department of Corrections, knowing the commissioners and the government liaisons, community supervision, Department of Parole, just kind of get to know all the key players and trying to build some kind of relationship, get an inside look at the nuts and bolts of our corrections system. So one of the things I've been doing since after session last year was making a visit to as many state prisons as I could. To by my count, there's 34 Florida private prisons. So I visited one of the core civic prisons and a number of our state prisons in Jackson, and mostly in the mid to northern part of the state. After this session, I want to concentrate on the southern part of the state, where I believe it's even more harsh. So things that I've seen firsthand that have kind of impacted me. And I will say that I've visited 2 prisons unannounced. They just kind of showed up. The rest of them, because I got a call from Commissioner Ward, he said, please don't do that. It really disrupts our day. So I've been trying to work with Robert Thrower, who is the government liaison, to schedule these. But I am going to make them aware that this year, they're going to be unannounced. But, because there were two very different experiences. The ones that were unannounced seem to be a little bit more transparent, kind of, nobody knows you're coming. When they know I'm coming, they roll out the red carpet, it's VIP status, and everybody's on the best behavior, and full staff, and we're all very smiling and welcoming. But I will say in general that there is kind of a wall, there's a defense, people are protective of that system, especially wardens. What I've come to know is that a lot of these wardens are in the end of their tenure with the state. They're 28, 29, 30, so they really don't want to rock the boat because they're just about ready to retire and get their pension. So economics is such a big part of this. That's why we have the private prisons, and it's my understanding from the Core Civic prison, the warden told me that we as a state are contractually obligated to keep them at capacity, at 90% capacity. We have a contracted agreement to keep them at 90% capacity, so we just got to keep feeding them. And another thing that's noticeable is that in most of these small, especially rural towns, the prison is the largest employer in that community. So there's an economic issue and factor. But the thing that probably affects me most, I've dealt with the heat. Most of these facilities are not air conditioned, and I went in the summer months, so it is hot. I'm sure it's worse in South Georgia where I'll visit this summer. But it's just the mental health factor. The largest mental health service provider in our state is Georgia State Prisons. And so we've essentially criminalized mental health. So these prisons are not a therapeutic environment at all. They're just the opposite. And as Representative Wynn was talking about, isolation, that just really compounds a mental health patient's condition even worse. And I have a number of folks in our program that came from incarceration and have a mental health diagnosis, and to hear the horror stories of them being in isolation with no medication, no therapy, is just cruel and unusual for sure. But, I'm optimistic that as we just continue to amplify voices and take a closer look, an inside look, that things can change. And that's really why I'm here, is why we're all here, to see reform in these areas. So I appreciate your attendance today. Does anybody have any questions?
Comment. I emailed you, I'm hoping that you can come next week to the Talk Justice Tuesday that's going to focus a lot on healthcare access, particularly around addiction services and mental health care. And we will have the state director for mental health services and corrections. She's attending.
What's their name?
I'm sorry?
You said the state director.
Dr. Javelle Jackson. Yeah, she's going to be coming, so, and just wants to hear more about what's not working, and hopefully we can put our heads together about what kind of changes we can bring about. So hopefully you can come. I have the email for you. Thank you very much.
But when you recognize that Georgia at best is number 47 out of 50 states in terms of mental health access, some watchdogs say we're number 50. And so we're paying for it on the back end, we're incarcerating it rather than giving folks adequate access to mental health care. So there's just a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that can motivate change is when something has a name. And I was just trying to look up the guy who wrote and published the SHOE syndrome, talking about SHOE syndrome with the solitary confinement syndrome. So we can talk to people about how solitary is creating mental health needs. And in this way, it's documented way that now we have the SHOE syndrome that people are talking about, then that may help motivate some of the change that we're looking for.
Yeah, just a few months ago, we had a lady who's in our program. She came from the crisis stabilization unit in Gwinnett, and she regrettably came off her meds. So she was in psychosis. She was walking down the street. None of us knew that she had a bench warrant. So they extradited her to Augusta to incarcerate her. And I went to visit her. They wouldn't let me in. But she told me after she got out how horrible it was. She stayed in isolation for weeks, but she was just really in a mental health crisis. It was just inhumane.
Do you know what the proposed budget cuts would do to mental health services within prisons and what the starting salary is for a mental health counselor?
I'm not sure about the salary, but I do know that, this is just going to be a compound effect. We need to be strengthening our mental health budget, cutting it, it's just going to make it much worse. I know we were able to get back some more of the money in the supplemental budget. We'll see how that goes. But I know the folks up at Gwinnett were very, very concerned about it because across the board, between 4% cut and 6% cut, you're talking about $80 million. And even in our community, they're already laying people off, shutting down group homes. And so it's just a major effect.
I think the starting salary might be about $28,000 a year for a mental health professional.
Not competitive.
Yes, sir. Thank you again for being here and all that you've been doing. If we were to look anecdotally at the statewide constituency, there is some leaning toward the empathetic side of this conversation. Among just ordinary people, even the conservative side of the electorate, right? The statewide electorate. Having said that, and that being accepted, what tips might you have about our approach to those of your colleagues who for some reason are still in that kind of rigid place?
I attended a criminal justice reform summit in Nashville last year, and they showed us some Pew Research where 90% of Democratic voters favor criminal justice reform and 80% of Republican voters favor it. And I asked the question, why aren't we swinging for the fences if we've got this kind of community support? But everybody's kind of just scared and apprehensive because they don't want to be that guy with the Willie Horton story. That's one thing. But of course, it's big business. The whole correctional system is big business and it has a lot of lobbying power.
The unspoken reality is the truth.
So we just have to keep the pressure on, keep our foot on the gas. I think we're going to see things change. Yes, sir.
Did you find the difference between your announced students and your unannounced students in the Christians?
No, it's very different. They were rattled. Didn't see it coming, blindsided, but I believe it gave me a truer picture. Because like I said, when they know I'm coming, I mean, it's a welcoming, greeting crowd, an entourage, and full staff with roses and chocolates when I walk in. But I intend to do more unannounced visits this year. Yes.
I didn't know if this particular meeting was for cruel and harsh and unusual sentencing. I don't know if you're covering any of that.
We're punitive. I mean, we over-incarcerate. Our sentences are too long. I'd love to get rid of mandatory minimums.
What direction could you point me to trying to get some help and
From my view, the folks that kind of carry the most weight around here, the prosecutors, the judges want more criminal justice reform. They want to get rid of mandatory minimums. They want more discretion in their courts. But it's the prosecuting lobby that's very, very powerful.
But when constitutional rights have been violated and those who have been put in charge of or entrusted with carrying out the law and doing right by people and doing justice for people, that's what we've come across a situation like that. And then when you confront them, then everyone, they cover each other's hands and hide their hands behind their back when they willfully and knowingly did wrong and violated several constitutional rights, due process, unequal, where I'm forgetting the law, but equal protection under the law. All of that stuff was violated, and it was done knowingly all through the court system, with the DA, with the lawyer, who are all in cahoots. And we have been fighting this thing for 17 years.
Obviously, we're not in a position to speak on individual situations and cases at this point. We're here more to focus on systematic changes that are needed. Ms. Garrity is going to speak in a few moments. She's with Southern Center and is going to talk about impact litigation that Southern Center has done, which is really trying to and is creating positive changes on a more systematic level with some of the things that you're talking about, constitutional violations of rights. So she's going to talk about that in just a moment. Brenda, if you have anything that you want to say about that.
You know, we just have to keep telling the stories and bringing people's attention to it. That's why Southern Center and the Justice Project and Janice's organization is so important. That's why the Just Mercy movie was incredibly important, because the average person is out of sight, out of mind. And until we tell people what's going on, I think we'll get a good reaction, positive reaction from the average voter. But we just have to make them more aware. I think awareness is key. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Representative, I just wanted to say that I thoroughly appreciate that you're going to focus on doing more unannounced visits, and believe me when I say I understand the pushback from the Department of Corrections on that. And I think that unannounced visits are key and are critical. And of course, the Department of Corrections across the country aren't really ecstatic about it. That's what we need for the transparency. And just as a somewhat of a side note, as an attorney, they only require that I give them 24 hours notice. So if I can give them 24 hours notice, I don't see any reason why a representative has to give more notice than that. Of course, unannounced visits are preferable, but with 24 hours, at least you have less preparation and less rolling out of the red carpet. So on that note, I'd like you to welcome Ms. Garrity to talk about Southern Center's impact litigation and all of the great changes and impact that's helping for our families.
Good morning. It's nice to see you all. I want to start by talking about a young woman that we represented. I'll call her MJ. MJ was 20 years old, and she was arrested right here in Fulton County at the West End Mall for criminal trespass. The officer who arrested her alleged that she didn't move on when she was preaching at the West End Mall and took her into custody. MJ was a young woman who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and once in the custody of the Fulton County Jail, she had an experience that is common to many people who experience psychiatric disabilities and find themselves in the criminal legal system. She was put into a solitary confinement cell. She was found incompetent to stand trial, and she was left to languish in that cell for months at the jail. We encountered her in her cell at the jail, and what we saw there were conditions as disturbing as I have ever seen in my nearly 2 decades of working on prison and jail conditions cases. Right here in the South Fulton Jail, the jail where we hold all of the women for Fulton County. We saw feces on the walls. We saw urine pooling on the floor. We saw toilet water all over people's cells, people using their bedding to sop up the toilet water. The smell inside the cells was horrendous. People without basic necessities, underwear, toothpaste, soap, shampoo. Women in distress. We also met there a woman named SHP, who also had been arrested for criminal trespass and also was someone with a history of psychiatric disabilities. She too was put in a solitary confinement cell for 4 months. And this summer, in litigation regarding conditions at the jail, SHP came to court, federal court in Atlanta, and told the federal court about her experience and described how she descended deeper and deeper into illness as she was confined in the cell. So it's no surprise to anyone here that prisons and jails, as we have heard this morning from our state representatives, have become the new asylums. And from my perspective, our society has placed some really unfair expectations on the people who run the systems. We ask those who work in these systems to do a difficult, if not impossible, task, and we give them very few resources with which to do it. So getting practical, jail is not the right place for the two women I've described and many, many such people similarly situated. And the fact is that our jails are full of people who do not need to be there. Both of the women that I mentioned this morning had bails set at, I think, $500 each. And yet MJ was in jail, in custody for almost a year. This was because she was found incompetent to stand trial. She was ordered to be moved to the state hospital for competency restoration. And that process for MJ and for many other people in her position, not just here in Fulton County, but throughout the state of Georgia, languished week after week, month after month, waiting for that transfer from the jail to the hospital. And as they wait and wait, their conditions get worse and worse. MJ was incarcerated for the offense of criminal trespass for a year, at the end of which her case was dismissed. If that is not an indictment of the system we have here, I don't know what is. If we take even a tiny step back from this situation, we have to ask ourselves, what in the world are we doing when we have a system here in Atlanta, that keeps a woman with a psychiatric disability in a solitary confinement cell for months on end, putting her life at risk for a misdemeanor criminal trespass. The other thing to note is that while MJ was in custody, she attempted to end her life twice. And she luckily survived, but others have not been so lucky. A woman named Kesha Brownlee was found in a garbage-strewn cell a couple of years ago. She, again, was someone with a long history of schizophrenia. And she ingested a plastic utensil, unsupervised, and she passed away. And I'll tell you that her family, as you might imagine, will never recover. We really need to be doing better. And the good news is that there is a growing realization among psychiatrists and mental health professionals and increasingly people who run our departments of correction and our jails, that placement of people with psychiatric disabilities in solitary confinement cells causes psychological harm, is medically contraindicated, and can even cause lasting permanent injury, and in some cases death, in too many cases death. The Georgia Department of Corrections, as we heard this morning from our representatives, has moved in some in one particular prison in the right direction, or is moving in the right direction. And I'm referring to the Special Management Unit at the prison in Jackson. This was a prison not too long ago that when our expert toured the facility as part of litigation, he found that this facility was one of the harshest and most draconian solitary confinement units that he had ever seen in his 40 years of visiting prisons around this country. It was a place where the department sent people that they considered, in their words, the worst of the worst. And it was a place in which people were confined year after year after year after year in extremely isolating circumstances, meaning I think 5 hours out of cell per week at best. That was policy. So that was what they were supposed to be provided. For people who had just arrived, 90 days in cell, 0 time out of cell. You would shower in the cell with a little spigot on the wall, no contact. When we did our tour, it became readily apparent that many people who were isolated in these conditions were experiencing psychosis and symptoms of serious mental illness. Those were the conditions on the ground a few years ago, and as I noted, to its credit, the department has seen the need to make some changes, and it has made some changes at that facility. 4 hours out of cell every day, programming that is to begin very shortly, out-of-cell programming for people who are locked down there. Use of tablets so that people are able to communicate with their loved ones on the outside and also get programming on the tablets, education and that sort of thing. Mandated time in the fresh air, albeit in cages, and other kinds of reforms have come to that facility, and they need to go to other facilities within the State Department of Corrections, and that's something that we are actively working on right now. One of the biggest root causes of any conditions problem within a jail or prison is population. It's volume, the sheer number of people that we incarcerate in this country and in this state. So to the extent that we can decrease population consistent with public safety, that is something that we ought to be doing, we ought to be thinking about. To that end, in 2015, our legislature passed a well-intentioned law that unfortunately has had very little effect. This was a law that was targeted in particular to people serving long sentences, life without parole, life imprisonment, or very long terms of incarceration for drug-related offenses. It was targeted towards people like one of our former clients, Aaron Tuff. Mr. Tuff is a gentleman from Moultrie, Georgia. In the 70s, he served in the armed forces. And as part of his service, he had to jump out of airplanes. One of those occasions, he injured his back. And from that point forward, was in a lot of pain and developed an addiction that later turned into a very significant addiction. When we met Mr. Tuff, he was serving life without the possibility of parole as a recidivist for possession with intent to sell 0.3 grams of cocaine. His entire criminal history consisted of the following. He had been convicted, I think in the 80s, early 80s, of breaking into a country store in the middle of the night. Immediately caught. He had written some bad checks out of his mom's checkbook and sum total of a couple of $100. He had had a felony possession of cocaine conviction for having residue on a pipe. And he had had this possession with intent to sell 0.3 grams. I don't know if we have a sense of what that looks like, but it looks like a few grains of rice, essentially. When we met him, he had served 21 years out of his life without parole sentence. And this law, this well-intentioned law that I referred to a moment ago, could not help him. And here's the reason for that. There is a glitch in the statute, there is a glitch in the statute, I should say, that makes it inapplicable except for to very few people. It makes certain people with drug offenses eligible for parole consideration if they meet certain criteria, to include having a good prison disciplinary record, having achieved certain things in the prison system, such as getting a GED, not having serious violent felonies in their past. And one other thing, it requires people to have a low risk for recidivism score. And the problem is that people who this law is designed to reach, they tend not to have this low risk for recidivism score. The score being a tool, the score comes from a tool used by the Department of Corrections to assess people's risk, and people who have substance abuse in their past, they may have a number of felony drug-related convictions in their past. It essentially doesn't help the very people that it was intended to help, and it needs to be amended. Just one more example, we represent a woman named Cassandra Hayes right now. Also somebody who has a history of substance abuse, but also has a loving family, is a loved member of her community, and is serving a non-parolable 25-year sentence, again, for possession with intent to sell about $20 worth of cocaine. She has a perfect record for the last almost 13 years in the Department of Corrections. She's someone who does not need to spend a single additional day in the prison system, not one more. And yet, under our current laws, she has very little hope of getting out. And that is something that I hope our state legislators will address in the coming sessions. We have come a ways in Georgia in the last several years, thanks to many of the good people in this room, and in particular to my wonderful colleague, Marissa Dodson. But we have a very long way to go. And I look forward to working with all of you to make more progress that needs to be made on behalf of some of the most vulnerable people in the state of Georgia. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for joining us before you have to go to the Capitol. We greatly appreciate your time. There are two other bills that are currently pending. We discussed already House Bill 714, which is going to place some limitations on solitary confinement. We invited sponsors of two of the death penalty bills to come and speak with us, but apparently they were not able to come. So I want to highlight those for you briefly. That way you're aware of them. You can talk to your representatives about them. I'm hoping you'll join us on the walk over to the Capitol. It's a short walk on the walk. After we leave here to talk to our representatives about those bills. So first and foremost, we have House Bill 702, which is a complete ban of the death penalty in Georgia, which would commute anyone who was previously sentenced to the death penalty to a life without parole sentence. So that's the first one. That's the stronger of the two bills, but also a good bill would be House Bill 267, which would make it impossible to sentence someone to the death penalty in Georgia if the only evidence of the defendant's guilt is one eyewitness. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has heard stories of people who are sadly sitting on death penalty with minimal evidence of their guilt. So both of those bills would be a step forward, one bigger than the other, but steps forward when it comes to the death penalty. Excuse me. And next I'm going to ask Brooke Bruce to come talk to the group. And the thing that I love about Brooke's story is that Brooke is not an attorney, not that you have to be an attorney or anything like that, but so many people who are in this realm of criminal justice reform are here because we were personally impacted, whether it was our own incarcerations, that of a loved one, someone that they know. And the only positive that I know of that, and that I've seen so many times, is that it has almost compelled in people this need to be a part of the movement for positive change. And so, Brooke, I would love it if you come up and join us and tell us how you got into this world of criminal justice reform.
Hi, thank you all for having me. I'm glad to be here today. Originally, what had brought me, I'd always had some interest in criminal justice reform, but recently the execution of a family friend of mine, he was the last execution in Georgia, it was of Donnie Lance. He was executed on January 29th. Most people don't know a lot about the case, other than what you maybe read online. The murder happened in 1997. He allegedly killed, he was convicted of killing his ex-wife and her current boyfriend. He was immediately taken up and taken into questioning. It was a very brutal murder. He was taken to the police department. His car was impounded, and in that they found no defensive wounds, no physical evidence whatsoever, which, being how serious the crime was, experts would later testify that it was impossible for there not to have been physical evidence on his person or in his car. He was also in trial. They used a witness that had taken a lie detector test, and it came out that when he had taken that test, he was actually high on narcotics narcotics and drugs and alcohol, but that wasn't allowed to be discussed in the case. The DA that was actually prosecuting that case ended up going to prison for embezzlement himself. His attorney, Donnie's attorney at the original trial he asked no questions about this polygraph test. He presented no mitigating evidence from Donnie's past head traumas. He had actually been shot in the head. He had been in several wrecks. He had a very low intellectual IQ. All of that would have played a factor as a constitutional right for him not to have received the death penalty, but none of that was presented in the trial. They had it was all circumstantial. Even if you look it up, the DA himself said, even though circumstantial, it was overwhelming. He was essentially tried and convicted on a past history, which I'm sure many of you in this room can relate. We all have histories, and if that can be what we are convicted on, that's scary. And everybody has a vested interest in that. There's a really great quote from Amanda Knox, who we all know the story of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she says, either I'm the psychopath that they portray me as, or I'm you. And I think if everybody really looked within themselves and, the choices that they had made in their past or family members that they have, they would really see that this doesn't just affect this small group of people. This affects everyone. And at any point, at any given day, we could find ourselves in a very similar situation. There was actually DNA evidence, too, that they did not have the capability to test back in 1997 when the crime happened. It was shell casings, hair, and latent fingerprints, and a boot print. And they, technology with DNA is ever changing. And so now, in 2020 and 2019, we had the ability to test this DNA. His attorneys presented the case for that. His children went and spoke to the courts. They spoke to the district attorney, and they were told no, that it was a delay tactic to test this DNA. So Georgia executed a man without testing physical evidence that's still, hopefully, I guess, sitting in a storage locker somewhere. And it went untested, and they killed him with lethal injection without testing that to make sure. And I think that everybody should have a vested interest in that. I would, of course, like to see abolishment of the death penalty in general, because for every 10 executions that we have had, there's been one exoneration, and that's not Alfred pleas or anything like that. That is just straight exonerations from third-party, nonprofits like the Innocent Project and stuff like that, getting involved to see these cases through. The sheer magnitude of what our justice system is doing, and the cruel and unusual punishment with solitary confinement and the death penalty, it's something that everybody just needs to really look at. And people's knowledge of it, I think, is about an inch deep. And unless it affects them personally, they don't see it. And it's sensationalized on the news. People probably heard Donnie's name when it was his last meal request, or, his last appeal got denied, and then now it's forgotten about, and nobody's talking about it, and nobody remembers. His kids remember, though, and we remember, and that's why we're here today. And we would love to get a bill passed, written and passed, that would mandate the testing. Because to me, it's outrageous that judges have the ability to deny testing, because if we're going to put people to death, that's permanent, and we need to make sure that we have the right person. And they can deny that and give no other reason other than it's a delay tactic, or we feel as if it wouldn't have changed the jury's mind, which was another excuse that was given, which they can't possibly know. So we would love to have a bill written. I would love if y'all would talk to your legislators about that. Potentially writing a bill where it mandates the testing of physical evidence, not just for death penalty cases, but for all cases. Because there's people sitting in jail right now that are innocent. And we as a people have to stand up and use our voice to try and help with that in any way that we can. So if you could just reach out to your legislators, talk to them about that. There's actually a big, conservative movement as well as a Democratic movement, to try and get some legislation done on this. And I think this is a great way, with such divide that there is these days, this is a great way we can all come together, because this isn't about what party you belong to. This is a human rights issue. Thank you.
As one brief point of clarification, I think that Brooke was trying to be polite when she said that the seriousness of the murder indicated certain evidence, when the truth is that it was a gruesome murder scene. And so the lack of physical evidence to connect her relative to that very gruesome scene was shocking if he was in fact guilty. So the reality that the state of Georgia has executed yet another innocent man is very, very real. So thank you for sharing your story, and really just how your personal connection has propelled you into doing reform work and being active in this community. So thank you. I think that, we asked the representative earlier, what do we think needs to be said to convince our representatives about some of these issues? And I think that it is about the personal connection. Everyone has a story, and you never know what a representative is going to connect with. And I think that when you tell the story of your personal experience or the experience of your loved one, the greater the chance of our representatives connecting with that and being motivated to make a positive change that we're asking for. So that covers all of the bills that are currently pending, to my knowledge. Am I missing anything important, Melissa?
No, I another one that I could consider is, hi, good morning, is House Bill 438, which is the juvenile shackling bill. So that is a bill that would eliminate or prohibit shackling of young people in juvenile court, and Gallagher has introduced that legislation. I also, while I've been talking about juvenile justice reform, want to mention House Bill 440, and which is the raise the age effort here in Georgia. Georgia is still one of 3 states that treats 17-year-olds as adults in our system. We can talk about how cool that is given the brain science and what we know about development. So that's an effort that Manny Gallagher is undertaking as well. A couple of years ago, there was an effort to deal with life without parole sentences for young people. It did not make it very far in the House, but I think it was introduced by a pretty prominent Republican who has since retired. I think that there may be some openness or willingness to recognize that we are really throwing our young people away, and we should be more intentional on policies that will allow them to have opportunity and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. We are purposely wrapping up early today with the speaking segment. I think that we're all here because these issues are important to us. I think we all have some knowledge of them. And so we're ending early because we want to all go over to the Capitol. Hopefully everyone can join us. We have some handouts at the table that include talking points. We also have some postcards that you can leave with your representative's office if you cannot personally speak with him or her, that talks about the Visit a Prison Challenge, and also explains that in detail so they know how they can fully participate. And we also have some virtual reality goggles, which if the person who's wearing them puts them on, they will have a bird's eye view of what someone who's in solitary confinement might actually see themselves. And so we're going to bring those over to the Capitol with us. And so if you're going to call your representative out and speak with that person one-on-one, you'll have the opportunity to hand them the goggles and ask them to take a look at it and truly have a better idea of what they're voting for when they're voting on this bill regarding solitary confinement. So, yes.
Sorry, can I make a comment?
You absolutely can.
Thank you. I'm from Emory. I do work on disability and criminal justice, and I'm part of a group that's trying to get like a Georgia, we're calling it the Georgia Justice Coalition, or just people to get together and figure out what the work is. So we're having a networking meet and greet kind of event at Emory. It's on a Saturday, so I don't know. But it's March 28th. There's a flyer out there. For the first hour, we're inviting people to give like 5-minute flash talks on what work they're doing and where they are interested in having collaborations and things like that. And the last 2 hours will just be for networking. So there's flyers out there. There's a QR code that you can use to sign up for the events and to do a flash talk. So we're hoping, and please share. Take one and show people and put it on your social media. Yeah.
Fabulous. Is there a social media associated with that we can share as well?
That would be great, and that's a good idea.
I don't know how to do that either, but I have a few good ideas. Before we get our umbrellas and our handouts and head over to the Capitol, does anyone have any questions?
I just had one. Is that to get disability folks more?
I'm sorry, no, because my personal work with disabilities is anything and justice involvement. So my personal work on disability, we'll have people talking about, felony disenfranchisement on the grounds, and so there are folks, and just really advocates, researchers, lawmakers, anybody as well that's interested in criminal justice work.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for telling us about that. Thank you for bringing flyers.
Yeah, and if you want an electronic version, let me know, and I can email you.
I just wonder if you all think it would be helpful to go through some tips, lobby tips, do's and don'ts for how to engage lawmakers across the street, or are people here pretty comfortable with doing that?
I think it should be done all the time.
Yeah, can you grab one of the cards over here? And maybe tips to people who are watching. Oh, sure, yes, thank you. So out front here, we have our criminal justice reform lobby tips, do's and don'ts. We are so excited about the opportunity to engage people. I can't tell you how often people say to me, it's crazy up here at the Capitol. Oh my gosh, I never knew. So I say that to say the more we get here, the more people who are living these experiences and working on these issues in their community, the more we're getting here and sharing our experiences and talking to lawmakers, the better off the work is. But it can be intimidating. It's intimidating for me, and I've been doing it for more than 10 years. So I think that it's always good to consider before you head over to talk to lawmakers, kind of how to get your thoughts together and how you might prepare yourself for this experience. And for those of you who have done this a lot, I'm sorry if it's redundant. For people who are watching on a live stream, we say, come on down to the Capitol. Although there are other ways that you might be able to engage from all over the state. There's information on the legislative website, www.legis.ga.gov. There is all kinds of materials in terms of contact information for legislators, committees that we're interested in that you can be a part of. You can email, make phone calls. There are all kinds of ways to engage lawmakers. If you're here today or when you come down, here are a few things that we ask people to consider. Some of the do's, kind of prepare. While you're thinking about it now, when we'll head over, walk over to the Capitol, think about, we've heard a lot of things today. We've talked about the death penalty, we've talked about solitary confinement, we've talked about juvenile issues. What is the thing that you came here today to talk about? How might you want to share your story or your experience with that? Make sure to highlight your experience. If you're someone who's impacted by the system, talk about why your experience informs what you're asking lawmakers to do. But make sure to keep it kind of short. This is not the time to expect lawmakers to want to spend 20 minutes with you or so. You should narrow your talking points to 3, 5 at the most. So think about your issue and what points you want to make sure to get across. Stay calm and polite. Lawmakers are not always calm or polite, believe it or not. But we are representing lots of communities around the state. As you all know, when someone has a first impression of somebody who represents a particular group of people, they are more likely to have those stereotypes about those individuals. And I think that we can all agree that people who are in the criminal legal system have a lot of unfair stereotypes that accompany their experience. And so we want to make sure that some of what people assume about the people that we work with is not something that comes across. So it's our job to remember who we're representing and why we're down here, and that no matter what they say or do, that we remain calm and polite and friendly. Be open to questions, but don't feel like you have to answer all of the questions. Answer the questions that you can. Jot down the questions that they ask that you don't know. Tell them that you'll find the answer, and use that as an opportunity to follow up with them in their office or later on by going and being a resource for them, so they know that you are a credible person, that is a person of your word, and that they can rely on for information down here. Quickly, I'll tell you that this is a part-time legislature, so most of the people nearly every one of the legislators has another type of job. They spend a very little time down here. They have to know all kinds of issues, from education to housing to transportation to infrastructure. So we can't expect them to all be criminal justice experts. So we need to give them the things we want them to know in small, bite-sized chunks. Don't give them too much. Make sure you know their position. Ask them, would you support HB 714 and the end of solitary confinement? They say they're not sure or no. Ask them why. See how we might be able to get them on our side. What questions do they have or concerns do they have that we might be able to use to inform our work in the future? Make sure to thank them no matter what they say or do. Thank them for coming out to speak to you. We can go through a little bit more of the logistics in terms of how you call people out when you get there. It can be kind of a cumbersome process. We'll talk about it a little bit on the way. But even if they come out and give you time at the ropes, thank them for it. Recognize their time is short and keep it moving. The don'ts. I've already said it, don't try to cover too much. I think sometimes we get people who are like, oh my gosh, when I was born, I was raised, my parents, my children, not the time for that, okay? But I encourage you to go talk to them in their district after. They love that kind of stuff afterwards. After the session, go spend 30 minutes or 45 minutes with your legislator. They'll give you that time then. Today is not that day. Don't avoid lawmakers that you think might be opposed. So out front, we have some directories of the committees that are considering criminal justice legislation. We like to target the leadership. Those are people who make the big decisions. Don't avoid the chairman of the committee or the vice chairman of the committee because it says that they might be a Republican and we might assume certain things about them. Make no assumptions about political parties down here at all. Talk to every person the same, and don't avoid anybody that you think might not share your views. Don't confront, threaten, or beg. People from Justice State have heard me say this. Please don't tell lawmakers we will vote you out of office. If you don't do what we want, we'll just make sure that you're not here anymore. Even if you think that, even if there are ways to hold people accountable for the decisions they make up here, that is not how we build partnerships and relationships, and we need to be thoughtful about the things that we say. Don't beg them. I understand that we are emotional and that you are sharing your experience, that there may be a reason for you to get emotional, but please don't use your emotions to try to curry some influence with lawmakers. It's not a productive use of our time or their time. Don't be dishonest. Please don't say things like, this is not happening anywhere else in the country, or, this will change everyone's. Don't make those kind of broad pronouncements that we can't defend. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't start answering questions you don't know the answer to. Just say, I'm not sure. Be happy to get back to you with that information. Don't be offended if they won't come speak to you. So they're busy. This is a legislative day. They're going to make time for us if we can. They may not be able to. Don't be offended. Think about how you might write a note to them that they can send and put on their desk. The way that it works really quickly, and this might be helpful for you all on live stream as well, is we have the Senate side and the House side. You have pieces of paper, small pieces of paper on the House side, kind of bigger pieces on the Senate that you fill out your name, your information, and then there's a line there that asks, what do you want, what message do you want to get across to your lawmaker? If you are a constituent, I cannot tell you enough how important it is to check the box, to write constituent as big as you can. They are much more likely to come out and talk to you and take your time more seriously if you tell them that they actually represent you. If they don't represent you, tell them what you're here to talk to them about. If they're the chair of a committee or sit on a committee, the Juvenile Justice Committee or the Judiciary Committee, tell them that you want to talk to them about HB 714 or HB 702. Tell them that you're interested in the death penalty. Tell them that you're interested in, one thing we didn't talk about today, but we could have, is the way that this state treats people who have been convicted of sex offenses. That is cruel and unusual in a lot of ways. So there's a bill right now to oppose. It's House Bill 720. It increases probation time for people who are convicted of these kinds of offenses. Write that information there. If they won't come out, at least they know why you were there. And if you can, follow up with an email or a phone call that says, I came by to see you today, was interested in talking to you and getting your support for this bill. Please give me a call or shoot me an email if you have any questions. Are there any questions of me?
Yes.
If you chooses to go from a distance, I heard this question, should we be concerned that I may go to the ropes or I may send a message to a legislator and somebody else is trying to get his attention and calling him out as well?
Yeah, so the legislator will come out with a piece of paper that the page sent in to them with your name on it. But it is possible that a lot of other people may be looking for that legislator, including, I don't have my badge on right now, but including people down here who wear badges, because we know their faces and go to them even though other people have asked for them to come out. So if that happens to you, and I would suggest, right, before you send the note in to get them, that you look on your phone to see what they look like, because they are going to come out with the note and say, roll in, and you're going to need to know, they come out from all kinds of different doors, you're going to need to know what they look like so that you can spot them. If you catch them talking to somebody else, if somebody else pulls them away, they need to be pulled away, they will usually tell you, I'll be right back, or do I have to go vote? Or is that all? I'm sorry, I have to go. They should give you an indication as to what they want. If someone else has their time, just stand next to that person. So if somebody like me, a very impolite lobbyist, comes and snatches the time with the legislator before you get an opportunity, just stand close enough to the lobbyist and to the lawmaker to let them know you're going to be respectful of the time they're sharing with the lawmaker right now, but before they are able to get out of here, you're going to get their attention. So if they turn to leave, you say, Representative Cooper, got it? Makes sense?
And so we shouldn't be afraid that they will say, oh, gee, somebody talked to me about that, go away.
No, right. Oh, you're talking about multiple times being called out. No, I think if anything, that demonstrates that now they might not come out again. So if they've gotten a note already that says HB 702, death penalty repeal, they may not come out again to that. But I don't think that, again, if somebody doesn't come out, you should not be offended as to why they might have come out. It could be that they've heard this message before. It could be that they're unavailable to come out. There's lots of reasons that could happen as to why they may not be willing to have the conversation with you.
If someone's not able to come down to the Capitol because of distance or transportation, do you recommend that they email or call? Is one more persuasive than the other?
I believe that calling is a little bit more persuasive, although the legislator doesn't get the call. The way that it works is the legislators have assistants or secretaries that answer their phone and take messages for them. So what we tell people to do is keep calling. And sometimes the legislators share the same assistant. And if the assistant is telling the lawmaker, your phone, every time you put the phone down, it's ringing for someone who's worried about this bill that's coming up. Right now, we are exceptionally concerned about House Bill 994, and we're getting ready to send out a call to action now so people can start talking to their lawmakers about that. We want phones ringing all day. All they hear is vote no on, that is what is being picked up on their assistant's phone. That message will get there. In terms of emails, I suggest people be creative in the subject line. These legislators get thousands of emails every day. Their assistants, and if you are savvy enough to copy their assistant on your email, it works better because then the assistant will get it too. Then you contact that legislator twice. They're probably not going to open up your email, so be creative in the subject line. Vote no on HB 994. It will not keep our communities safe. Vote no on HB 720. This is harsh and ineffective public policy. Vote, constituent says, vote no. Things that all they're looking at is that line when their email's blowing up, so all they're doing is scrolling through a whole bunch of vote no or vote yes on bills we care about. That, I believe, is a more effective strategy than thinking about the 9 or 10 paragraphs that you might put in an email. Although you can and should, it's not likely to be read at this time in the session.
And how do we know who a representative's assistant is?
So on the website that I mentioned earlier, you have a list of the committees and you have a list of the representatives and senators. You can go down to the committees and look for the committees that, and you'll see the director here, the ones that most often deal with criminal justice issues. Again, that is in the House of Representatives. It is the Judiciary Non-Civil Committee. It is the Juvenile Justice Committee. It is the Public Safety Committee. There are others that may hear criminal justice reform bills, but those are the ones who are more likely to get that legislation. On the Senate side, it is the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Public Safety Committee. So those will be the committees you'd be looking for to see who you reach out to. If you clicked on that committee, it'll give you all of the legislators and what their role on that committee is. If you click their name, it's going to give you their bio, their office location, their telephone number, their assistant, a link to email them. If you're looking for just a representative or a senator, you can go again to look at a list of representatives or the list of senators, scroll down and find the one you're looking for, click on it, and all that information should pop up for you. You should be able to contact both the legislator and their assistant through that channel. Any other questions about this process? Yes, ma'am.
If you know that your representative agrees with you on the issue and is going to vote the way you want them to, do you waste their time and pull them out of session?
I love that question. So the question is, what do you do if you know your lawmakers on your side in support of the bills you care about and want to move and oppose the bills you don't like? I don't think that it hurts to let your lawmaker know that you're down here. But I wouldn't prioritize talking to my lawmakers. So I think that if we plan to try to reach 3 people today, everyone said, I probably have 3 conversations in me today. If you thought that one of those people would be somebody who represented you, I think that would be a good thing. Come down here, make sure that they know that people are coming here to talk to them about this issue. If there are talking points or handouts that you might be able to get them so that they are equipped with the knowledge. A lot of times, we assume that because someone is of a particular party or who has expressed values that we espouse, that they are also informed on all the issues. And I think that just like I mentioned to you before, they just can't be experts at everything. So sometimes they just need to know that we are resources. So even going to your lawmaker and saying, I'm here down here with the Justice Reform Partnerships, Talk Justice Tuesday. Do you know about these series? Do you, today was about solitary confinement and the death penalty. Do you know, is there any way we can be helpful in trying to stop or support some of this legislation? Bringing that information back to some of our partners could also be a way to build relationships and strategies down there at the Capitol. Other questions? All right, lobby tips, do's and don'ts. Let's get on over there. Thank you, Janice.